Well, time for The View now, looking at the opinion pages of today's newspapers. Boris Johnson is almost everywhere. He is backseat driving, to use Amber Rudd's phrase in Patrick Blur's cartoon in The Telegraph. The Foreign Secretary driving the cabinet on a windy cliff edge as he repeats the words from his tweet, "We're right behind you, Prime Minister." In the same paper, Charles Moore writes that if Mrs May is in the driving seat of Brexit, she has treated the public as if she were the tense mother of children on a long car journey. He says the Prime Minister is unwilling to answer the basic question, are we nearly there yet? Quentin Letts defends Boris Johnson in the Daily Mail, writing that the Foreign Secretary's article offered a magnificent, upbeat and tolerant vision for Brexit. But Bruce Anderson, the Financial Times, says there is only one purpose behind Mr Johnson's Brexit intervention: ambition. Gina Miller, whose successful court action forced a parliamentary vote on Article 50, explains why, in her and her legal team's view, the government's £1 billion payment to the DUP also requires parliamentary approval. And in the Daily Mail, the former Work and Pension Secretary Ian Smith calls on British business to get involved in sorting out the UK's productivity problem. Mr Duncan Smith will be speaking to me about that. That's just after 11 o'clock. Well, here to go through those stories are Sonia Sodha, the leader writer of The Observer and a former advisor to Ed Miliband, and Lucy Fisher, senior political correspondent at The Times. All right, then, all these articles about Boris Johnson, which one do you think hits it on the button?
Well, I was very interested by Charles Moore's take on this, that really with Boris, whatever you make of the substance of what he was saying, the flair, the bombast, the vision to set out his ideas about Brexit in this 4,200-word magnum opus really just shows the vacuum that's been led by Theresa May. She's not very good at communicating. She's left the stage clear for him to come in and do this. It's been too long since her Lancaster House speech, perhaps. I know we've got this Florence speech coming later this week, but Boris's flair just shows how sort of dry and wooden the PM can be. What
do you think? Has he put himself back in contention?
Well, I think he'd like to think he's put himself back in contention. For me, it was always a question of, I think, when, not if, Boris was going to sort of break free of Theresa May and the government, because we know he's incredibly ambitious, as Bruce Anderson says in the FT. He's had a very long game plan, a very long strategy. He wants to be PM. He wants to be top dog. That's always been the plan, I think. And so I think he sees this as part of, getting there. I agree with Lucy that I think Theresa May absolutely hasn't put enough detail on the table around Brexit. There's been a lot of kind of rhetoric, but very little detail on Britain's negotiating strategy. But I think she's in a very difficult place, because as soon as she starts to flesh out Britain's position, I think it becomes more and more apparent that Brexit is not going to be the walk in the park that Leavers argued, and it becomes
Boris
easier.
Johnson's still arguing.
Well, of course he's still arguing that, but I mean, he's living in fantasy land. You read that 4,200-word article, and you were left none the wiser as to how Britain was going to achieve all these things. It's a complete and utter fantasy.
I mean, has he come up with any new answers, do you think?
Well, he certainly overstepped his brief as Foreign Secretary to sort of intervene on health and education. I think he has overstepped what seemed to be the growing cabinet consensus over divorce payments, how much should be paid into the EU budget after we leave Brexit for a transition period, and how long, 2 to 3 years, it seemed to be the consensus growing that transition period should be. But I'm interested in the split between how people are viewing Boris. You know, it seems, Sonia, that you're kind of taking this intervention as very much an attack. It's all driven by his ambition. I read this far more defensively. You know, it's been said by his allies that he's very hurt by claims that he lied in the EU referendum campaign about the £350 million for the NHS from the EU budget contributions. He's hurt by claims that he's been lying low, that he's been marginalised by Theresa May. I think this has probably been triggered more by fears that, the rumours about him possibly being demoted in an imminent reshuffle, perhaps. It's from a back foot that he's come out here and made such an extraordinary intervention.
And I think it's classic Boris Johnson, isn't it? You get caught out telling a rather big lie around the 350 million around the NHS, and he just comes out and has repeated it again. And he's actually been, quite extraordinarily, I think, he's been chastised by the UK
shows a sort of
Statistics
Trumpian
Authority.
self-confidence that might actually play with the voters, whether it's true or not.
I suspect it will play with the voters, but I think there will be backlash. I think a lot of the evidence around why people voted the way they did, a lot of the focus groups around the referendum vote suggested that the £350 million claim for the NHS really resonated with voters, and voters believed it, and they are expecting extra money to go to the NHS. Now, that money doesn't exist, so I think that the risk for a politician like Boris is that there may be a backlash down the line.
Lucy, where does this leave Mrs May? Because she's got this big speech on Friday, which many people thought would be a re-emphasis or a new emphasis of her position on Brexit, yet he appears to have put down sort of red lines in advance.
Oh yeah, he's absolutely preempted this keynote speech that had been widely briefed to the press as the key moment this autumn, as some crunch moments, pressure points come next month with the EU Council meeting for May. It's very difficult for her. You know, she's obviously taken the decision not to act to discipline him. Obviously, anger and number 10, feelings that this has been a regrettable intervention by Boris Johnson, but she's decided to believe that this is not, overstepping the collective cabinet responsibility. It's interesting that Boris, not always the most credible man, hasn't had many allies coming out and defending him. Michael Gove has distanced himself from the intervention today, so I think Theresa May is in a better position today than yesterday because everyone's distanced themselves from Boris. Many of her allies, Amber Rudd, Damien Green, George Freeman, have been out on the airwaves slapping down Boris. She's relied on her outriders to not have to deal with it herself.
I think we'll probably resume this conversation in the next hour. I look forward to that. Thank you very much. This is All Out Politics. Coming up next, I'll ask, do the Conservatives have a